Hi everyone, it's me again and welcome to my channel. These are the materials I'm going to use for this demo. And this is an old pastel I've done of the same scene, just to give you an idea. It's a made-up scene, so I used my own painting as reference. And here we go. I have drawn it out first on my Arches cold press paper. I usually always start with the largest areas first. So in this case, it's the foliage and the frontal areas, and then the trees behind the little house. I start with my lightest colors first. I'm using my gorgeous dagger brush that I love for just getting the lovely marks and flicking the paint on. And I always use a lot of color when I do this. I don't pre-wet the paper first. I'm working straight onto dry paper. As I'm working, you will see me put other colors in, like there. I'm starting to merge in some purpley color. That's cobalt blue with opera rose. And I use the drinking straw a little bit just for some random marks. I like to blow the paint. That's usually just in foreground areas though. Not always, but occasionally I use it. And now I'm building up using negative painting technique, and I'm working the foliage of these trees in behind the house to make the roof, the sharp edges of the roof, stand out. I'm using a number 8 round brush, which is also the Silver Black Velvet brand, and that's just to roll out some of the water that stayed in puddles on my paper before I go on to the next stage. And then I go back to my dagger brush again and continue with making foliage and random trees come out of the background. That's why I'm leaving some white paper exposed in the shape of tree trunks. Sometimes I use the side of my dagger brush and sometimes I use the point of it. So it's a matter of rolling the brush around to make different marks. But I always do start with my light colors first. Now I'm using my flexible palette knife, and that's just to scrape back into the paint when the paint is just losing the sheen on top of the paper. That's when it's a good time to do this and slice back in. And I always wipe into a paper towel, which is in my hand, in between the slices. Now I'm going to apologize up front for the speed of this film. I didn't know my camera was set on this and I don't know how to correct it. So it's going to be quite a whirlwind demonstration just for a couple of sections. I did the sky with the mixture of blues, and then I used a wet tissue and I just rolled it in that area for my clouds. Then I went back now to doing a little bit more foliage in the foreground, blowing with my straw and gradually building on the houses themselves. Now the trees, just starting with a light color first, and then I introduce my brown and starting to get some foliage on the trees, still leaving a lot of the background colors showing through. When I'm using my brush to make the trees, it's still my dagger brush, and I'm turning the brush every which way to get all the little twists and turns into my marks. I use my fine little rigger to get the little branches, the nice tiny branches coming out from the trunks, not the dagger brush for those. And now I'm just going back and reinforcing the darks. And you know, when you use watercolor, you don't have to be afraid of the dark. You can go to the dark side sometimes because watercolor dries so much lighter than you anticipate. So be brave. So long as you leave a good demarcation between your lovely colors and you still have those layers showing through, like your first layer, your second layer, now your third layer of paint, then you're going to get a nice feeling of depth, and you need the darks to make that happen. I'm using my number 8 round brush on the foreground shed, starting with a light color first, and then I'm building up to my middle values and gradually to a darker value. I've scraped back into the darks, you'll notice, into the trees in the background, and I've used my palette knife for that. You saw me do that before, so I didn't repeat myself there. It's just to make another depth or another element of trees. Here I'm just using a little stiff scrubber brush to take out some paint. I accidentally painted over one of the posts. So now I'm going to go into the shadows here, and I've used cobalt blue with opera rose. It's a beautiful colour mixture together. The shadows are very important because these are linear details, and those linear details help the viewer move into the middle distance and the background of your painting. So I'm doing them deliberately in a very sort of random way so that they're interesting. I'm leaving a lot of white paper still showing. And you notice once I put that paint down, I soften it a little bit, just soften the outside edges of the shadow. And now I'm going on to the fence itself. I start with a light colour first, the way I did the trees, and then I introduce the brown over the top of that for the darker side or the shadow side of the posts. So I've skipped through this part fairly quickly just to show you that you don't need to do an awful lot of detail for this sort of thing. Sure, you can put detail in and you put it in strategically in certain places, but the main detail should come at the end of the painting anyway. So I'm just getting my main elements situated before I go into anything really tight and linear. Now I've just put in a little wash into some of the area on the pathway, and I softened that with my dagger brush as well. And now I'm just making a little gate. I've drawn a little lattice work on the gate, and I'm reinforcing some of the darks between the fence posts. You can still see layers of the paint that I've used. There's the blue, which is ultramarine and burnt sienna. There's the green, which is sap green and ultramarine. And now I'm just splattering some of the yellow and quinacridone gold into the foreground area just to give it a little bit of texture, something to excite the senses as you enter into this painting. And I use my palette knife again just to cut back into certain dark areas. It just gives it another depth again. And now we're working on the main roof of the house. This is quin gold and cadmium orange. And I'm just working with that colour first in a very light hue, and then I've added a little bit of burnt sienna and the cadmium orange mixed into that. This is the shadow side of the house or the roof, so areas of this can be darker. But you notice throughout the whole painting there's still little chips of white paper showing. That's really important. It does keep your painting fresher, and it makes your colours look so much more lively. So I gradually just work through areas. I'm adding and subtracting. I take my round brush and I roll that into some areas that might have gotten a bit sloppy with paint and remove some of the water. And I'm adding some pretty brilliant colours here. That orange is really quite bright, and if you mix that orange even with the opera rose, you're going to get a wonderful colour. Now I'm using a tissue and I'm rolling it, and I'm going to blot that in. There's the light side of this chimney and the light side of the roof. And I'm just taking out some of the paint. It's just a different way of taking the paint out, and I'm using the thirsty brush technique as well. So putting in some shadows now underneath the eaves of this little house, and I've used French ultramarine and a little bit of burnt sienna. I gradually weave my way through, and I'm leaving out the space for where the poles are going to be for the house. Obviously the shadow is going to be a bit deeper up underneath the eaves, but it's going to be lighter as it extends down to the lower area of the little veranda, or what I think might be a veranda. Back to using my blotting technique with the tissue. Just getting some different marks. Just scraping it even sideways is quite fun. And now I'm reinforcing some of the darks, ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I'm weaving that into the shadow side of that roof. And this little house has a much lighter roof because it is into pretty well full sunlight, so I'm only putting a very light wash on that, and I went back into the darker areas of this little part that extends at the doorway, and I'm using French ultramarine and burnt sienna. And now I'm casting a little bit of a shadow cast from the trees, and it's basically opera rose and cobalt blue. And I always soften that mark. That was just like I did on the pathway. Put the mark down and then soften it with a slightly damp brush. Using the palette knife to just make a little bit of an accent on that doorway. Don't have to put a lot of detail in. And the poles I painted, remember, and now I'm just going back in and cutting back in with my palette knife. Now I feel that the yellow was a little bit intense right here, so I'm wetting it with my thirsty brush because it's dry now, and I'm blotting it. And I'm trying to take some of the intensity of that colour out. Yellow is one of the most stubborn colours to get out, and I probably went a little bit heavy-handed when I first put that on. And I've done the same on this side. I'm just loosening up the paint and blotting it. And this little shed in the background is just a little extension of the house. So I'm just putting a little bit of character into the shadows there where the 2 points meet. But always keep some of the underneath colour still visible. So it gives you a nice play of demarcation. Now I'm really heading to the dark side in some of these areas now, and this is when I'm getting back into using more deliberate painting in the negative painting, trying to push the trees forward, and I'm using my round brush for this. A little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and sometimes I'll use French ultramarine and sap green, and even a little bit of quinacridone gold mixed in that. That's all with the foliage in the background. Now I'm using my little rigger brush, just getting a few tiny little branches to come out from my trees. And I'm starting now with my round brush again and dragging some shadows across the trunk of the tree to give it a little bit of form. Back to my shadows under the eaves now that that paint has subsided a little bit, and I'm just giving it a little bit more punch, a little bit of shadow just to make the two platforms of the roof and the underside of the building separate. The little lattice gate I'm working on now, I start with cad orange, and I did introduce a little bit of Scarlet Lake into that, just to give it a slight redness to that lattice work. Going back to reinforcing some of the linear detail on the fence, not too much, just a little bit of demarcation between the shadow side and the light side of the fence poles. And back to my tree, doing exactly the same thing, just reinforcing, especially on the roof area because the darks had gone quite light again as the paint had dried. So now it's time to use less water with the paint, and then I'm going to get a slightly darker effect. A couple of linear marks on the chimney, and that's pretty well done. As my painting's coming to an end, I start to just assess where the darks need to be a little bit more gutsy and go through frontal areas in particular and just reinforce some of the shadows there. I reinforce some of my shadows on the path. Same colour, just a slightly thicker mix of paint so that it's darker in value. And the same with the foliage. I'm trying to push bushes forward, so there needs to be a slightly darker value behind the frontal bushes. The shadow draped across the roof, that's opera rose with a little bit of cobalt blue, and then I soften the mark. These are all the final touches for my little painting, and I'm trying to pull it all together now. Some broken line on the veranda roof of this little house. Breaking the line makes it a little bit more three-dimensional. Don't make it a continual line. And I mixed a little bit of white gouache with some yellow paint and added a little bit of the sap green into that. And I'm just popping that in places where I think I might have gone a little bit heavy with the darks. Now it's time to sign my painting and we're done. I hope you enjoyed this little demonstration, and please come back and visit me again. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.